Thank you all so much for joining this Lunch and Learn. Excited to have so many people here in Arizona care about what's happening in Arizona when it comes to home and housing, and all the work we have ahead of us of what we need to be doing when it comes to that space. Housing is not an easy space to understand. It's not an easy space to do advocacy on. We're not going to do all things in this next 45 minutes to an hour where you'll walk away housing experts, but we do want to have you at least walk away hopefully with some passion and some inspiration to go do some advocacy in the housing space here in Phoenix and throughout Arizona. A little bit better understanding of why we're here as far as the crisis, both in the homelessness space and in the housing space. And then, of course, getting connected to all of the great Valley Leadership Network alumni and partners who care about seeing Arizona be the best it can be when it comes to housing. So the two blue boxes that say Impact Maker, that's the Impact Maker team. I'm Dave Brown, I'm the CEO of Valley Leadership. Amanda Straight is the program manager for all things Impact Maker. Those are across our 6 impact teams. The Housing and Healthy Neighborhoods Impact team is under our health team. As many of you know, especially those that are alumni, we're big believers in the social determinants of health, and that housing is one of those key cogs within it. In fact, we'd go even a little further and say home is where it all starts, which is a great, exciting campaign we helped launch just a couple months ago that you'll hear more about today. So we're going to run through things pretty quick as far as our 3 presenters, which I'll introduce here in a second. But if you have questions throughout anything, keep it for the end. It can get a little distracting with the chat and seeing questions and things come up in the chat. If you can save to the end, and then we're going to go through all things at once. But Amanda, go ahead to the next slide, and I'll kind of give a quick overview of who's going to be talking today. So Sarah Shambrook, who will be joining us just a little later. She's on a flight or just getting off a flight. She is Government Relations Director for Dominion. She's also our Housing and Healthy Neighborhoods to Do item lead. So she is the VL alumni that's leading all of this work for the team. Catalyze Class 1 alumni, Katie Gentry, Regional Homelessness Program Manager for Maricopa Association of Governments. And I know many of you in the housing space have probably heard Katie speak and all the great things and informative things she has to say, both on housing generally, but in particular with the homelessness space. Nico Howard, who is chairman of the board of Home Arizona, which is a business-led group looking to increase the housing supply. He's also the chair or sits, I don't know if he's chair, I think he sits on the Phoenix Planning and Zoning Commission. He'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. And he's also a VL Institute Class 41 alum. And then to end all things, we'll have Ash Us, who's just a fantastic advocate in all sorts of ways for housing and homelessness. She's also the founder and executive director of From the Ground Up, which works on all sorts of housing and homelessness issues, and just a great insight into the housing and homelessness crisis here in Arizona. So to start us off, though, will be yours truly, and just to give a little bit of a background on the Housing and Healthy Neighborhoods Impact Team generally, and a little bit very quickly, because we want to get to the content about our model. So many of you know VL, been around 40 plus years, learning things. We've now moved towards learning things to do things. So our strategic learning programs, that's Catalyze, Explore, Institute, all these other things we've done, is for and in service to strategic doing. So we don't want you just to know about things. We want you to know about things and then go do things as a result. And we want that doing to be very strategic, intentional, and leverage. So we just don't want you out and about looking at housing, out and about looking at health, child well-being, jobs in the economy. We want to be doing it with great partners like we have here today to really move the needle on some of these issues. And that strategic doing is what we call the impact maker. And it's completely based on a key principle that leadership is action. Not title, not position, not how many boards you may sit on or have sat on, but really, are you willing to do something for Arizona, in particular in service to a particular issue like housing and the other issues that our teams are working on. So if you are really willing and ready to roll up your sleeves, and based on everybody joining us today, you have some inclination possibly to do that in the housing space, we're glad you're here and we're happy to have you. Our leadership is in action, and action is based on values. So we're not just saying, hey, go do things. We want you to do things and operate from what we call our principles of doing. There are 5. These are our values that we want to have all of you operate from when thinking about and doing things in the housing space. So are you building trust? This is a huge one, especially in Arizona. You may not agree with everybody, but you need to at least build relationships to understand where the other side may come from so that you can build trust so that we can ultimately see something get done. Go ahead and you can just line them all up there, Amanda. Integrity, recognize your own biases, appreciate data, which you're going to hear a lot of today, and know what to do and make decisions based on that data. Team mindset. All of our teams are intentionally called teams. They're not working groups or steering committees or boards. They're teams. You're going to work together for a long time on any issue in Arizona. And so we want to have that team mindset front and center. Driven to do. We want to see something happen and get done in Arizona. Again, housing and any issue really is not going to be solved overnight. So we have to be driven to do constantly to say, hey, right here, what's in front of me, what can I get done, what comes next, and make sure we keep moving towards that. And then lastly, we want to put Arizona first. It's not about political party. It's not about personal ambition. It's about saying, hey, we want to see something improve for Arizona generally, and we want to put Arizona first before anything else. So that's what we hope all of you operate from when it comes to putting in motion the advocacy work around housing and what you may do. There's going to be lots of stuff to do, and we want to make sure that these are front and center when you think about who you talk to, how you talk to people, how you show up at council meetings, how you show up at neighborhood association meetings, all those things. We want to have the VL set the example on leadership. It's actually part of our long-term vision that our alumni do set the example on leadership, not just for the state, but for across the country. So with that quick background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Health Impact Team, which is the group that's organized all of our housing work. So as I mentioned before, social determinants of health, where you live is more important than than your DNA code, zip code, better, more indicative of how long you'll live than your DNA code. So we want to see all Arizonans enjoy good health. We want to see them live in healthy communities, have access to affordable healthcare and wellness resources, and that we want to see the needle move, because everything we do, we want to make sure some needle moves, and that's that Arizonans live longer. And in particular, those disproportionately hit by life expectancy are living longer too, and those disparities are removed. So that's our Health Impact Team. As I mentioned before, we're huge fans of the social determinants of health and that vitalist wheel that I know many of you have seen. In particular, two areas that we work on, one is opioid stigma reduction, and the other is housing in healthy neighborhoods. So how do we get more inclusive communities where Arizonans have a safe and healthy place to call home? You can learn about all of our teams at impactmaker.org, impactmakeraz.org, but that's the crux of this team. Let's get communities built. Let's get more people saying yes to communities and home where every Arizonan can call it a safe and healthy place. All right, so what you'll learn today, and then I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, a little bit about the housing crisis in Arizona. Again, these are going to be in 15-minute blasts, so you're not going to get the whole world, but you're going to get a good idea. What are the driving factors of homelessness and rising housing costs in Arizona? How critical is the crisis? Katie Gentry is going to give you a lot of numbers and data. Take in as much as you can. There'll be some overarching, just this is what you got to take away. That we hope you can carry on into other conversations as you start thinking about your advocacy. Why is it hard to build housing? Nico Howard will go into some of the barriers, again, sitting on the Planning and Zoning Commission, being a developer himself. There's lots of things that come in the way when it comes to getting more housing built. To a very large extent, housing, if you remember Economics 101, the demand and supply graph, and then the price. When there's low supply, price goes up, and especially when there's high demand, those things move. Nico will go into a little bit about why that is, and then what we can do about it at the local level to get more housing built. And then lastly, with Ash, we'll learn how you can make a difference to do something in your community, sharing the importance of housing, sharing the importance of getting more housing built, making sure we're meeting community needs across that entire housing continuum. Again, it's not just homelessness, it's homelessness all the way to home ownership and everything in between, which again makes housing such a challenging place to do any kind of advocacy work in when you're talking about so many different parts, and each part being its own complicated mess of financing and everything else. So again, not the world in one bite at the apple today, but we hope we give you enough information to understand what got us here, why we're continuing to struggle, and then what you can do to make a difference as part of your first toe dip into the world of housing advocacy. So with that, I'm going to finally shut up and hand it over to Katie Gentry, who's going to talk a little bit more about the housing and homelessness, some graphs, some charts, some things to get your brain excited. Again, hold questions, keep them out of the chat. We're going to do all three presentations, then we'll do some Q&A with Sarah Shambrook, our team lead. And Katie, take it away.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome all. If you'll go to the next slide, Amanda. So quick overview of this presentation overall. I'm going to talk through housing and the data around housing, and then move into homelessness and how homelessness has gotten to the stage that we are today. Throughout all of this, and Amanda, I'm hoping you will share slides. I tried to hyperlink to all of our different most of our stuff is available online. I would say like all of our stuff is available online. So throughout this, you'll see those kind of green hyperlinks. Feel free to explore on your own as we go through. One of the dashboards that we launched about a year ago is Housing Explorer dashboard. So this is really looking at all the different dynamics that go into housing. We are actually in the process of updating it right now as we speak. So more data to come in the latest iteration soon. But if you'll go to the next slide, what I want to start with is really talking about that dynamic of supply and demand that Dave was just talking about. So from 2000 to 2010, we built almost 400,000 units. We then ultimately just stopped our building. And from 2011 to 2021, we have not yet recovered that housing rate that we were building previously. So what that's leading to is we do not have enough housing for the number of people. And keep in mind that we are the fastest growing county in the country. So through our 2015 kind of till present, we've seen extreme population growth, and that building has not kept up with that extreme population growth that has happened. So what does that result in? We've seen sale transactions skyrocket. So back in 2011, you saw about 75% of sale transactions being under that $200,000 mark. Those are virtually non-existent right now, and about 10% or 15% of our transactions are now under $300,000. So that makes it really challenging for especially kind of that new homeowner or that fixed income homeowner to be able to actually own a home and move them into the rental market. So next slide, you go into our rental transactions and apartment rents, and you see a very similar mark right there. So back in 2010, our Q4, we saw 90% of our units were $1,000 and under. Those are now less than 10% of our units are $1,000 and under, and you're starting to see that peak of blue across the top. So we went from having a portion of dark blue, which was under $500. Those no longer exist, and now we have a lot more units that are that $2,000 and above. We are seeing this across the region. So this is not just in kind of any particular area. Those apartment rent percent increases are kind of anywhere and everywhere, and therefore we have rents increasing anywhere and everywhere across the entire region. You do see that kind of increase in some particular areas, specifically where there was low income rents. So kind of in that Glendale area, kind of across this the 60 as you're going out to the west, you see kind of this greater increase than maybe previously had increased in rents. Next slide. One of the particular places that has become to fruition is cost burden. So when we're talking about cost burden, we talk about that you should not spend more than 30% of your income on rent and utilities. When you shift over, extreme cost burden looks at spending 50% or more on rent and utilities. About a quarter of our renters do spend 50% or more on rent and utilities, and half spend 30% or more. That quarter is incumbent within that half, so it's not an addition of 75%, but do know that there are a lot of folks who are spending more than they should be spending on rent and utilities in order to have a balanced budget at the end of the month. Similarly, this is not a shock. This is happening all across the region. There isn't one city that this is happening more in. It's kind of happening all across Maricopa County, as shown here in your percent of renters. Next slide. So you may wonder, why am I talking about this? I spend way more time, as Dave mentioned, in the homelessness space, but a lot of those issues that are happening on the housing side are inadvertently influencing our homelessness numbers. And so on a quarterly basis, we produce what's called the Homelessness Trends Report. This is looking at data out of our homeless management information system, which all of our agencies across the homeless system enter into. And this is created on a quarterly basis and does a lot more diving into talking about why the trends are happening. It's a 4-page report. It talks about our kind of the first page gives an overview of people coming into homelessness. Who are those people coming in and who are the people leaving homelessness? The second page goes into demographics. So race, ethnicity, age, gender, and then it compares it to census data. Our third page looks specifically at our subpopulations. So whether that is families or veterans, people experiencing chronic homelessness, which is that longer length of time homeless, youth, so people under 25 who are experiencing homelessness on their own. And then our last page is really looking at some of the metrics that we look at and really understanding. But that is available on our website. You're welcome to look at it. We also feature some takeaways. So top takeaways from the report to really understand what you're looking at in the report as well. Next slide. So going to break down, you'll see graph kind of slowly getting, we had 6,282 people experiencing homelessness, which was 8,188 people. So over 8,000 people experiencing homelessness and interacting with the homeless response system throughout the month of March. Next slide. I'm stealing this from my friend Ash, but she just recently completed a gaps analysis with a ton of people experiencing homelessness and asking them, what are your primary reasons that you ended up not having a place to stay? And the majority of them are economic factors, with the second reason being health issue and the third being family. But I don't want to look over the fact that lack of affordable housing, and all three of these really do ultimately go back to this lack of affordable housing and a lack of housing overall. So we know that these economic factors are really impacting. The other thing that we hear kind of consistently is, are people just coming here experiencing homelessness? And actually we find that the majority of folks experiencing homelessness in Maricopa County have been in Maricopa County for quite a significant amount of time. So it's the lack of housing that is happening that is driving people into homelessness, or some of these other issues that resulted in them experiencing homelessness, but they would consider themselves Arizona residents. Next slide. I would be remiss not to share this. We have more people coming into our homeless system than leaving on any given month. So throughout 2022, we had 21 people entering for every 10 leaving our system. So this is directly from that homelessness trends report that I talked through earlier. But as you can see, even in March, it's almost 3-to-1 people coming in for people leaving. And we have way more people coming in than the resource going out, which says we don't have enough housing for folks to get into, and we don't have enough resource to send them back into within the system. Next slide. This is data showing our outreach. So this is outreach across the entire region. We have outreach teams, and I really just show this to say that there isn't one place that people are experiencing homelessness either. Similarly to, we have apartments raising everywhere, we have people experiencing homelessness everywhere. So it's across the entire region. There's not one city that is experiencing it more than others relative to population. And so I definitely think it is important to share that, to know that a lot of folks stay experiencing homelessness in the region that they feel safe and comfortable, and that's oftentimes where they previously lived. So if I am experiencing homelessness in Chandler, I probably want to get housed back in Chandler, even if it's not necessarily as affordable as somewhere else in the valley. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Katie. Great presentation. Lots to absorb there, so absorb it, friends, as you can. And then I'll introduce Nico Howard, who will probably excite and inspire you, that your brain will be going all over the place by the time it gets to Ash, who will calm you all down and say, there's work to be done, and here it is. So Nico, take it away.
Dave, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Nico Howard, and I'm one of the co-founders of a group called Home Arizona. At Home Arizona, our mission is to educate policymakers and elected officials on the relationship among housing prices, labor availability, and economic development. Katie did such a great job of covering the data. I'm not really going to go through a lot of this with you again. These slides are really just meant to demonstrate the fact that we have seen robust and continuous population growth over the last several decades. Not sure why that last bar isn't coming in, but somewhere between 650 and 1 million people in the last several decades. We'll move to the next slide. We've seen along that same period of time really strong and continuous employment growth. And so what we've seen is, obviously the only months that we've had negative employment growth, or only years, is in 2020, and then the last one before that, 2010. Obviously in 2020, we had COVID, so some of that was a little bit expected. Please go to the next slide. Looking at the supply along the same period of time, as Katie mentioned, we have slightly different data that we see in terms of the number, but the trend is very much consistent. From 2000 to 2010, we saw 487,000 housing units delivered across the Phoenix MSA. From 2010 to 2020, we saw less than half of that supply was delivered, showing only 240,000 units. I will note that was the smallest number of deliveries in any one single decade since the 1960s, at a time when population growth was strong, when employment growth was strong. And we believe that those things serve as a really reliable proxy for household formation, or stated another way, demand for residential housing. So really strong demand, really weak supply. Where does that put us? That puts us in a housing shortage. And in any kind of shortage, you will always see an incredible upward pressure on pricing, which is exactly what we've seen. In 2021 alone, we saw close to a 30% increase in the cost of housing. From 2017 to 2022, across almost every municipality in the Phoenix MSA, we've seen the median home price double, or more than double. Next slide, please. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's the issue. I think most people on the call today understand that it is an issue, that it is something that we want to address. But in order to address that issue, we really have to talk about the cause of the issue. And I created this slide to show a couple of things. Number one is it's there are many factors that go into this. But number two, many of those factors are simply outside of our control at the municipal or even the state level. And so I just wanted to quickly run through these with you. We have international supply chains. In COVID and shortly thereafter, we saw a tremendous disruption across the world to our supply chains. We've largely gotten those back into check. Some of them are now better than they were. But again, our policy at a municipal or a state level is never really going to change what's happening in international supply chains. We go to labor shortages. This is an issue that persists certainly locally and nationally as well. It will continue to persist for the next decade. There's a number of factors that go into that, all the way from demographics in terms of when people are retiring, healthcare, individuals staying home to care for loved ones, or without access to daycare. And then the hot button issue, which I'm going to stay away from because it's politically charged, and again, it is a federal issue, is immigration. And we're just not going to solve that in this room today. So we go to interest rates, right? We go to monetary policy. We've seen a 30-year fixed mortgage go from 3%, and in some instances even lower than that, call it, down to 2.75%, all the way up to 7.25%. Is where it was last week. That's driven by Jeremy Powell and the Fed. Not going to change that today. It's just not something that's within our control. So you'll notice that I put in all caps and bold, spoiler alert, housing policy. And I did that for two reasons. The first is a significant amount of cost is driven by the policy that we put into place. But more importantly than that, that's the one thing that we actually have control over, are the rules that we put in place governing who builds what, when, where, and how. And so the last one that I put is the time to build and the nature of construction. I will touch on this later in the presentation, but there's a 2 to 5 year lag from when we as a developer say, hey, I'd like to start developing this parcel, to on the multifamily side, when we actually deliver a building and people move into that building and you kind of have an occupied building. And so I'll talk about why that's so important later, but that housing policy controls the time of that lag. If we could remove a year, 18 months from the approval, permitting, and construction process, you meaningfully change the supply equation and how quickly we can deliver new inventory. Next slide, please. So what is housing policy? Housing policy is a collection of rules that controls who can build, what they can build, where they can build, and how long it can take them to build. This is a picture of two guys that dressed up in a zebra costume and got mauled by lions, and it says bad ideas. This is one of them. Might give you a slight preview into my thought on our housing policy. Next slide, please. A lot of people say we have a housing problem, and that is true, but the housing problem is a consequence of an upstream issue. And I believe what we really have is a policy problem. And I just want to talk about what is good policy, what is bad policy. From my perspective, this is the world according to Nico. Feel free to discount appropriately. Good policy is policy that brings you closer to your desired outcomes, your stated objectives. Good policy gives you more of what you want, more of what you at least claim to be seeking. And I won't go into that one at this time. Bad policy does the opposite. Bad policy gives you less of what you want. It takes you farther away from your desired objectives. Next slide, please. And so I just put some policy principles. And, this is the whole concept. I'm not going to go into taxes today, but this is all of the philosophical underpinnings of taxes in general. If you want more, and I should say taxes and incentives, if you want more of something, make that thing easier and cheaper. If you want less of something, make it costly and burdensome, right? If you want people to do things less, tax it. If you want people to do things more, give them an incentive. And in our current landscape, from a policy perspective, we say that we want more housing. We say, hey, we really want affordable, we really want workforce, we really want all these things. But then in practice, our policy makes the process of delivering that housing extremely difficult, extremely expensive, and just generally across the whole, really, really, really unpleasant. And the more societal good that you are trying to do, the more complex and unpleasant this process becomes. And so it is much harder to develop affordable housing units today than it is to develop Class A multifamily. And that's part of why a lot of people don't do it, is because the hurdles that we've created, the complexities that we've created, they make it almost impossible to do, and really, really impossible to do profitably. So people don't do it. And that's one of my main messages today is, if we want to get in front of this issue, if we want to solve this issue, we have to make the process of doing the right thing easier and less expensive. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go too deep into all of these, but I just wanted to go through what the phases of development actually are. I think that a lot of folks, if you're not in the development field, you may not know all of these, and you may not know how much complexity goes into actually building something today, but it's really difficult. And so let's actually jump to the next slide. I have some timelines on it. You have kind of the negotiation, the identification, and the acquisition. This is the process where I, as a developer, say, I think that piece of land is where I want to build a multifamily project. I want to buy it. So I have to go out, I have to contact the seller, I have to get to an agreement where we agree on economic terms and everything else. That could take, I put 3 months, but that could really take 1 to 9 months, depending on how long you're tracking that piece of land, sometimes years. Then the developer really needs to underwrite that project to make sure that it's financially viable. Not only that they can build it, that the city is going to allow them to build it, but that they can build it profitably, because this is the stage in which they go out and they seek their capital, they seek their funding. So they're going to have to usually get equity and debt. They have to convince a lot of people to put a lot of money into a project, and that takes some time. So call that 4 months. Most people will not start spending entitlement dollars. Entitlement refers to zoning and receiving approvals from a municipality to actually build something. So before I go build on most land, I usually, there's not just a lot of readily available multifamily land in the city of Phoenix or Buckeye or wherever. So the city has to go through a public process where they say, will we rezone this to the use that you want to see? And that could take anywhere from 9 to 18 months. A lot of zoning attorneys will tell you 9 to 12 months. I personally have had 2 or 3 projects in the last 3 years that were closer to 18 months across multiple municipalities. So this is not a Phoenix thing. This is not a Peoria thing. It's kind of everywhere, and it depends on where you go. Design review, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is the process where we actually look at the aesthetics of a project and we say, we want it to be prettier. We want it to have more glass. We want it to have more metal or, multiple materials, so that we have a diversity of materiality. And it depends on what municipality you are, how you do that. Sometimes this is a separate public hearing process, like in the city of Scottsdale. And that's a particularly challenging thing because, again, that alone can add 9 months to the process. And if the materials that we require are expensive, it can add 20, 30% to the budget of the vertical construction. Permitting, it should take 6 months. This is the process of actually getting your construction documents, your structural engineering, really drilling down on a project to look at your plans to say, as a city, we're okay from a health and safety perspective and from, a design perspective with you guys building this product. Should take 6 months across a lot of municipalities right now. It's taking 6 to 12. Construction, and again, this one is partly out of our control because there's all these labor issues, there's all these material issues, but that'll take about 12 to 24 months. And where this is really within our control is inspections, getting the city to actually get out there when they say they're going to get out there, having the right staff to support construction and move that quickly. And finally, lease up and stabilization. This is really catered more toward multifamily than single family. Single family is a faster timeline and you don't really lease up, you just sell. But this is actually getting people moved into the building, which will take some time. Next slide, please. So across the entire spectrum, you're talking a minimum of 3 to 5 years from when you identify a site to when you actually deliver an occupied building. And that's important because even if we today decided we all have consensus, we all know how we're going to solve this issue, we're all going to work hard to solve it, we wouldn't see the benefits of those efforts for another 3 years. And during those 3 years, we would continue to see population growth and household formation. So demand moves a lot faster than supply. Demand might change overnight. It's going to take you 3 years to actually give the necessary supply to meet that demand. And I believe that housing policy is the fastest way to reduce that lag time. Our goal should be to get that 3 years down to 1.5. Next slide, please. I think a lot of that happens in the zoning process. And I'll tell you why. In Phoenix, I'm just using them as an example. You have 15 villages. They all feed up to the Planning and Zoning Commission, who renders a recommendation to the city council. I'm currently the chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission. This is my second term. I've been on the commission for probably 6 years. Next slide, please. And here is what I've seen in my time there. We have tremendous shortfalls in our zoning process, and the biggest issue comes in the form of community input. Now, I want to just say 30 seconds on community input. It's a good and a bad thing. I'm not advocating that we get rid of community input. I do think that we need it. Here's the good side, and it just goes back to we the people. We the people elect officials to take actions and behave in a way that reflects our ideological beliefs, right? Our ideologies. We do need representation. Electeds should be accountable. But here's the bad side of that. A lot of the people who are getting involved in this process do not have a good education in how development works, do not have a good education in the relationship between some of the things that they're advocating for and the costs that that imposes on housing. So you get folks that really, they might fight density and they might be successful in fighting density, but what they don't understand is that they're making that entry-level housing out of the financial reach of their grandchildren. And so those same folks will say, we want to fight the nasty developers for putting density. We're also really upset at the nasty developers because my kids can't afford to live in the community in which they grew up, and they don't understand that there's a direct correlation between those two things. Just a quick word on the citizen participation process. It's not inclusive and it's not always representative. And what I mean when I say that, you just have to look at the nature of these things. When people are against a project, they knock on 50 doors in the neighborhood, they rally together with their neighbors, they build war rooms in their kitchen, they bond over fighting against this common enemy. It's almost like it has this valor, this nobility. It becomes part of their identity. When people support a housing project or when they're neutral on a housing project, here's what they do. They open a beer, they sit on their couch and they watch football, because happy people don't take the day off work to testify at council meetings. Happy people don't sit in 6-hour planning and zoning commission calls just for the sake of it. And so I'm not saying that nobody testifies on the positive side, but when you're up there and you're looking out at a sea of unhappy faces, it builds this perception that there is an anti-development sentiment, that the community doesn't like it, that the developer is doing a bad project. But the reality is, if you have 50 people show up at a public hearing, that's a ton of people. But let's put things in perspective. In the city of Phoenix downtown, if you're building a project, there might be 50 or 100,000 people that are impacted by that project. And we're listening to this 50, this vocal minority of kind of what we call NIMBYs or anti-development folks. And so we've moved from a model of who is most correct, who is supported by the data, what do we really need to do to get our housing market in balance, to this model of who has the loudest voice, who is the most upset, who is organized the most bodies. And I'm just hitting time. I'll fly through these. Go to this next slide, please. I've really covered all of this. The last thing I'll say is, we have a lack of education on our villages and on our boards. And I don't say that disparagingly. What I mean is, when I stepped onto the Planning and Zoning Commission, there was no formal education process. Staff did not sit me down and say, these are the relationships in planning and community development. They just imported me as I was. They imported my biases. They imported my strong opinions. There is no arbiter of truth in this process to step in and say, well, actually, if you developed commercial here, that would be way more traffic than if you did a multifamily project. And that's a problem. We need to get in front of that. So I'll just say NIMBYism may not kill all good projects, but it adds a lot of time and expense to the end consumer. And the final takeaway is, if you want more of something, make it easy and cheap. Any obstacle that you add to building housing makes it more expensive, and that expense is ultimately passed on to the end consumer. If you want to lower housing costs, eliminate barriers to delivering new supply. And then finally, there is an inherent conflict between quality and cost. If you want architecturally exquisite housing, you will have less of it. If you are willing to make certain compromises with respect to design and materials, you can get more of it. Guys, that's all that I have for you today. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Nico Howard. My organization is Home Arizona. Appreciate you sharing your time with me.
Thank you, Nico. Let's get on to our final presenter, Ash Us. Ash has again, very grassroots, ground level perspective on homelessness and housing, the workings of how it happens at a council meeting, all the advocacy that has to happen, that does and doesn't happen based on what side you sit on. And so, Ash, thank you for sharing some time with us about all of your experience and expertise working at the very grassroots level.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and thanks, Amanda, for having me. It's really nice to meet all of y'all. My name is Ash, as Dave said, and I am the director and the founder of a Phoenix-based consulting agency that works on different projects related to housing and homelessness. For the portion of my segment of this workshop, I wanted to just start with this Dorothy Day quote for a lot of reasons. For a little bit of context, Dorothy Day is responsible for founding the Catholic worker movement with Peter Morin. And this was a movement that started primarily in New York, but how this movement started was through the building of hospitality houses that were in urban corridors where there were high concentrations of poverty and a lot of need. And Dorothy Day's vision was that she could bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots, or those with privilege and those not, by building these hospitality centers where unpaid volunteers came and lived and worked and provided things to the community. So a lot of them were soup kitchens, a lot of them were just places where people could come and get clothes, very, very, very basic needs stuff. And the lens through which she did that work was pretty intentionally not with a charity mindset, but with a solidarity mindset. And then it evolved to becoming advocacy work. So a lot of the folks who were living in the Catholic workers got involved with labor movements in the 80s and 90s and beyond. People got involved with environmental work and environmental justice work. I love this quote for so many reasons. This is really just my ethos of how to actually advocate and how to show up and what to do. She's saying a lot of people question, what's the sense of our small effort? We can't see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. And I respect and admire the work that she does, but that's how I got started in this work, really. When I lived in Boston, I was pretty involved with some Catholic worker initiatives there. And then when I moved to Phoenix, I moved here to live in a Catholic worker inspired program out of Andre House. So for a whole year, my first real year of working in the space, I was living in direct community with men who were transitioning out of homelessness, eating the food at Andre House every day, taking people to hospital visits, trying to get them healthcare. It was a complete immersion into homelessness and housing, and it really shaped me. Amanda, you can go to the next slide. And so I'm really here just to talk about some strategies and some of the things that I learned in my experience over the last couple of years. So you want to advocate for homes within reach. You care about housing, you care about homelessness. Most people are so overwhelmed with it that they do nothing. And as Dorothy Day said in the previous quote, there's too much to do to just sit back and feel overwhelmed by it, which it can be really overwhelming when you think of all of the things that need to happen. But on the other side of that, there's a piece of the puzzle for everyone. We talk about the housing spectrum vitalist specifically mentions that and kind of lays that out really nicely for us, that there's everything from a homeless shelter to home ownership. And we all can find our place on that spectrum. We can find our role in advocating. And so that's why I recommend the first step being figuring out your place. And the cool thing is there's a place for everyone, right? There's going to be people who are very willing and eager to just jump in the middle of a protest or show up to a city council meeting and be a public speaker. And then there's people whose gifts may not align with that and they can do work behind the scenes. So there's a place for everyone, but the real starting point is figuring out what matters most to you. Do you really care about seniors? I mean, we all probably care about everyone, hopefully, but do you care mostly about seniors who are falling into homelessness because they're on fixed incomes? Do you care about people who were justice involved who cannot find housing because of felony conviction? Do you want to show up at a place like St. Vincent de Paul and serve a meal, right? Like figure out what it is for you and where it is for you that you can start. Because a lot of times we just need a starting point to these problems, an entry point. I often give the example of the Affordable Care Act. I know a lot of people have different experiences, opinions, points of view on that, but President Barack Obama, when he talks about the Affordable Care Act, he says, well, yeah, of course the goal was to have affordable health care, but it was really to prove the concept. The Affordable Care Act that he put into place was what he called the entry point into solving this global or this national problem we have in our country. So start with figuring out what matters to you. The second step is figuring out who your city council member is. And on the next slide, when you all get the slides, some of the cities that you all are a part of, there's a link where you can just go on the website and put in your address and figure out who your city council member is. This is huge. A lot of advocacy work that I've seen, and I'm sure that many of you have been a part of, happens at the state and the federal level, and those policies are critical. We certainly need to be working on that. But my experience working at the local level is that people really don't understand the impact of what happens in their local city council, and with what Nico was talking about at the village planning committees and the planning commission. There's a huge way to be involved and to have a significant impact if you can get involved at that level. And then we look at our state legislature. There's again a link where you can put in your address and figure out who that is. Usually what I recommend to people is to follow both of those groups on social media. Because that's the best way to keep involved with important zoning cases that are coming up, things that they're working on, really just kind of getting a feel for the projects and initiatives that they're involved with. That's a really great way to do it. And then once you know who they are, contact them. Be persistent. I will email a city council member 4 or 5 times. I'll call and leave a voicemail 1 day a week, every week for 6 weeks. I mean, you definitely have to be persistent, but getting to make that direct contact is a really great way of staying in touch with them. And then that higher tier of involvement is attending a meeting, getting involved with your local homeowner association or neighborhood association. And some of that has to do with a few of the points that Nico made of who shows up to meetings. We see a lot of people who are strongly opposed or challenged or concerned about something show up to a meeting when there may be more people who support it, but they're not involved, they're not paying as close of attention. So whatever neighborhood you live in, chances are there's a neighborhood association on your city's website. If you go to the neighborhood services department, you can usually put in your address and find out if there's a neighborhood association. They meet about once a month. It's not a huge time commitment, and just show up to those. When I lived in Coronado, I got involved with that, and not only was it a good way to meet people in my community, but it was really neat to know, like I said, what was coming up and what was happening. And then the other thing I really just wanted to share, the next slide is just links. So Amanda, if you want to go to that, here are those links that I was talking about. And when you all get the slides, you'll be able to click on those. But The other thing I wanted to touch on in my time was just to give a kind of narrative of one of my experiences, one of many, getting involved with advocacy and at the local level. And so in 2019, a few of the social service providers filed a request to amend a special permit to add shelter beds in Metro Phoenix. And it was a really contentious case. There were a lot of people who had a lot of concerns about it. It was in some sense simple because what we were trying to do was use existing space that we already had to shelter people, but it was complicated for a lot of reasons. That area of Phoenix where the zone is, homelessness and homeless services had been concentrated there historically for many years. And there is this huge need to regionalize our approach to homelessness. So it was just very complicated. So we filed that request in 2019, and it didn't go to the Phoenix City Council until February of 2021. It took a long time. Of course, COVID slowed that, but the real reason that process slowed down was because of some of the opposition, because of just the conflict, the tension, the challenges associated with the case. And throughout that process, my role was really to manage our community engagement and our community outreach. And so for those 3 years, I was going to every church, every business, every neighborhood association, just nonstop around the clock, trying to meet with people to understand their concerns, to answer questions, to do all of that work. And all of this, really just to say the key takeaway is that the greatest way to advocate for anything is through a direct relationship. And so whether that is, again, with your city council member or your state rep, that's, one way to go about it. But the highest level of advocacy, the deepest and richest, most impactful way from my experience with it was through being in the community, through knowing the community that you're in, the communities that you care about. A lot of the challenges with planning and with zoning and with housing development, you tend to see developers, many of them from California or other places coming into communities to try and do something. And regardless of, obviously I'm an advocate for housing, but I certainly never want to diminish the concerns that people have or the lack of information that's there. So real takeaway again is just advocacy. It starts with knowing what you really care about. It starts with identifying where you can have the greatest impact. And then it's a matter of figuring out how to follow through with that. And starting with your city council member, your local neighborhood association, your state rep, those are all great starting points for that process. And advocacy is slow. I think we've seen this a lot in our country over the last couple of years. There are a couple of funny memes that talk about like how certain types of advocacy work are sexy or interesting, for the lack of a better word. They're exciting. There's an instant gratification in doing it, and those things are critical. But thinking of my experience working on trying to add those shelter beds, it's slow. Like I said, it is every Sunday going to a different church or a different community site, or walking around and canvassing in 120-degree weather and knocking on doors, or it's slow. It is not something that happens quickly if you want it to be done in an equitable and sustainable way. So thank you all for having me. I think our contact information will be provided. Feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns.
Thank you, Ash. Let's get into, because I want to get back to Q&A, because I know people have questions for all three presenters, and in particular Ash, because that's where this will all start, and that's how you'll take action. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, who's going to walk through some quick and easy things to just get you warmed up and started as this housing impact team takes advocacy to the next levels. Go ahead, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda. I'm the manager of strategic doing here at Valley Leadership. So I support our Impact Maker team and will be helpful managing a lot of the work that the Housing and Healthy Neighborhoods wants to do. And so I'm just going to walk through a few steps you can do maybe to get involved in this effort. The first one is we developed a template letter. If you are passionate about housing and you believe that home is where it all starts, feel free to check that out and use our links to find your council member and mayor and send them and, you know, express your interest and your support for housing in your neighborhood, because we know that that is really important. They get a lot of emails and letters from people who, you know, like Nico was pointing out, are fighting back on density or various issues, but we know that the more letters and support they can get from people who are supportive of more housing in their communities is really important. The second step is learn more about this Home is Where It All Starts campaign. And if you read that letter, you'll find some language from our campaign that is embedded in it. So the Home is Where It All Starts campaign is really a partnership with several organizations, including MAG, on how we can better communicate the importance of housing in Arizona. We know that the messaging hasn't always been right, and so how can we communicate that where you live is really important to your health and all of the factors that go into we're promoting healthy neighborhoods. So take a look at that campaign. You can sign up, download the toolkit that has a lot of social media posted information, a lot of which are for housing partners, but are also useful for everyone to really understand what the messaging is from that campaign. And it's also the messaging that we'll be using in our impact team work as we try and go out and kind of convey this message as well. And then the last step is to fill out the interest form. If you're interested in joining our impact team or contributing to our impact team work, there's an interest form link and you can sign up and join in a variety of different ways. So I'll go through kind of 3 different roles. Our overall goal is really to identify a myriad of ways where we can actually go and influence decision makers on housing efforts. So that may be supporting specific projects. That might also just be supporting language in the general plan. So we know several cities are looking at updating their general plan. How is it addressing housing? Is it making efforts to make housing easier to build? That sort of thing. So we have some target cities in mind, but we're also interested in where we live, where you all live. The people who are interested in this project live, and that's going to kind of contribute to where we focus our work. So there's 3 different roles you can have. One is a leadership role, which is really kind of leading efforts in the particular city, potentially a village if you're in Phoenix. And that's really to help us track the projects that are becoming before commissions or councils or other things that are happening. You know, we have a variety of ways we're trying to get information on that, but the more people we have paying attention to what's happening is really important. You know, like Ash mentioned, you know, a lot of things are happening in village planning committee meetings and planning commission meetings that, you know, you might not know is happening. So leadership, really paying attention to that and bringing that back to the group. And then utilizing the VL resources to engage other alumni and kind of help spearheading that information, attending public meetings when it is important, and continuing to write, you know, letters of support. Impact team member role, less on the kind of organizing all the information and helping us collect information on kind of what we're activating, but just playing a critical role in helping to do some of that outreach and in also attending meetings and writing letters. And then the contributor role, I put timelines on this. You can see of how many estimates, how many hours a month estimated to contribute, but the contributor is really going to be variable because that's really just being available when we ask you. You know, if something is happening in your community and we reach out and we say, we really think you should attend this public meeting, then you are signing up and hopefully able to be there. So those are the different roles you'll see in the interest form survey. You can pick which one you are most interested in. We also, in that interest form, just, you know, it has a place for your home address, which isn't required, but we do ask at least to provide your zip code so we can find out kind of where our interested members live, which helps us to kind of decide where we're going to focus a lot of our work. With that, Dave, I think I'm going to turn it over actually to Sarah, who is on and has managed to join us. You can see QR code links to those 2 documents in case you want to get ahead of everyone before I can send out the slides. But other than that, I think we're ready to turn it over to Q&A. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Well, thanks everybody for joining. My name's Sarah Shambrook. I work with Dominium. We're an affordable housing developer located in Phoenix. We're a national developer and have about 4 offices across the country, but one of our corporate headquarters is in Phoenix, and that's where I work, though I'm not currently there. I'm currently in Minnesota at the airport. So sorry that I'm just kind of flying in here with you all, but I'm excited that you all were able to join and ready for this Q&A. So we don't have a ton of time. So I'd ask, that our panelists keep their answers relatively short, and you'll be able to reach out to anybody on this panel after the fact. We will also stay on for, a little bit after time. Anybody who needs to drop, feel free. But if there is a question that, you're dying to get answered, I'm happy to stay on and chat with you. So I think the best way to do this, Dave, is just people raise their hands. I don't know, Amanda, if you can see that from your end, and we can go from there.
Yes, go ahead and raise your digital hand. And Anderson C. Not sure that's your name, but that's what Zoom is calling you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Courtney Anderson. I'm actually a civil engineer in land development with Intellis. I've recently had a project in Phoenix and went through the whole process from zoning all the way there in construction. But I did find that I agree with Nico as far as running into problems as far as experience and development that the leaders had. So that caused a lot of hiccups. And there was also discrepancy of what the city would allow and what the neighborhood committee was asking for. So if we adhered to the neighborhood committee, we later had to change that to appease the city, actual code and everything. On top of that, there was a stigma. We were doing multifamily, and for some reason there was a rumor kind of going around that it was low income community, and this project wasn't. And people just really didn't want the rezoning for a multifamily community in their backyard because they thought that it would bring in lower income housing. Has anybody else found that stigma to be an issue? And if so, how do you propose we combat that?
So I'll jump in and then I'm probably going to throw it to Nico. But, the first thing I'll say is, yes, absolutely. I think that's a massive problem that we're facing in Arizona. It's one of the biggest issues. Personally, I don't think NIMBYism or not in my backyardism is the actual problem. I think it's a symptom of the problem. And that problem is that we haven't built enough housing. And one of the reasons we haven't done that is because there's not enough zoned land for multifamily. We've grown so quickly. We have very little supply. And so, a symptom of that issue is then, a few folks in the area get really riled up about something that they just have misconceptions about, and then ultimately kind of convince other folks. And like Nico mentioned, that is a very not inclusive process. I mean, not a lot of people can take off, work in the middle of the day if it's during the day for city council, or like a Tuesday at 6 p.m. if there's no childcare. You don't have a lot of, folks that aren't necessarily privileged coming to these events to kind of go against multifamily housing, and Dominium does all affordable. So I'm right there with you. But Nico, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and I'll just throw out, Sarah, I think you said it well, and great to be here with you today. Sarah and I know each other because for a long time we worked on a project together over in Buckeye at Jackrabbit and Thomas. I was the owner of that land. Dominium was the buyer of that land. I want to say it was 300 plus units of affordable housing. Unfortunately, that project was killed. It didn't go forward. We were okay on the land side because we were able to get another use that ultimately was financially viable, but it was a shame to see that we lost those affordable units. And when you went to these zoning hearings, to use Ed Bull's words, the zoning attorney for the case, I mean, it was like you were stepping into Birmingham, Alabama in the 1960s. There was a lot of rhetoric around, we don't want, quote unquote, those people in our neighborhood with, and it was just appalling. I mean, it was just something that you shouldn't see in this day and age in the current times. And so I guess what I would say to you is, yes, the stigma is very real. I think that there is a lot of misinformation that floats around in the process. As I mentioned in the presentation, there is no arbiter of truth. Staff does not do a good job of stepping in and saying, actually, that's not true. Actually, the rents are going to be this, actually. And if you look at some of the Class A being built today, and I'm not saying that, Class A is the solution to everything. We need housing at every step of the spectrum, socioeconomically speaking. But you can look at some of the housing that's being built, and you can actually look at the rents that they have to charge in order to make this financially viable. And then you can look at a lot of the mortgages in the area, and you're like, you're making these arguments that you're upset that that these folks from a different socioeconomic bracket are going to live in your neighborhood. Number one, that's a disgusting argument to make. But number two, it's not true. I mean, on some of these units, the actual cost of one of these units is more than a mortgage, right? It's more than what folks that moved in 20 years ago are paying today. And so it's a difficult question. The short answer that I see as the problem is that there is an anti-development sentiment that has just been pervasive throughout our society. And we change that through conversation, through education, and ultimately through collaboration. When you juxtapose this against the water issue, for example, that's a much easier issue because you don't have people that disagree that they want water to come on when you turn on the tap, right? When everyone agrees, when I turn on the shower, I want water to come out. It's a tougher one because you're overcoming pre-existing beliefs and pre-existing sentiments. And I would tell you that the way to overcome that is by having these conversations, by having these presentations, and I think ultimately talking about the economics, because there's a lot of ire that gets directed at the developers that I just don't think people understand how the capital stack is structured. And there are things that are done that are suboptimal, yes, but there are reasons why it is done that way. Most developers are not self-funded. They are getting funding from equity investors, from banks for debt. And you have to convince these investors to give money for these projects to ever exist in the first place. And you have to convince them that they're going to make more or an equal amount doing that as they are buying Apple stock, or those investors buy Apple stock. And so it's not greed. It's not a desire for profits. It's what is required to do to secure the financing for these projects to exist in the first place. I know I threw a lot at you there, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Nico. Let's go to Senator Epstein. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
Thank you. It's a great discussion. I appreciate everybody's input. Nico, I wanted to say thank you for putting it in black and white, that your list of the comprehensive list of causes, because if we want to improve housing, we can't just talk about zoning. So I appreciated your whole list there. I did want to bring up, though, that, and I also appreciated that you were very honest about, let's look at public policies, and because that's where we can have an impact. It's hard to impact something like interest rates because that's a very global thing, much impacted by the Fed, really. But there are some things that we can do in a couple of these categories that you sort of brushed aside. Interest rates, for instance, community banking and public banking are an option that we could look into to help people get a mortgage with better interest rates. But the labor shortages is where my question is going. So workforce development is very much something that public policy can have an impact on. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about your needs for labor supply, and please understand that what the reasons for my questions are. Too often I see bills go through the legislature that seem like, what a great solution, but it doesn't solve the problem. So I want to make sure that we're going to actually be solving the problem and getting something that really makes an impact. And if we do things that just create this enormous bottleneck when it comes to labor shortages, then we've really missed the ball. So I love your list of these are the many causes, and I want to make sure we're taking a really comprehensive approach to it. So can you speak as a developer about the labor shortages?
Absolutely. And first of all, let me just say you are spot on everything that you said. I appreciate you bringing all this up. Sometimes in a 15-minute conversation, it's harder to get into some of that granular detail. But I'd say 2 things. And I didn't want to go into this because I'm not as much of an expert. I might turn some of this over to Sarah Shambrook, but you are absolutely right. There are things that we can be doing on the economic side, incentives that we can be providing both at the state and the federal level, whether you're talking about LIHTC, whether you're talking about buying down mortgage rates, which is exactly what the public home builders are doing today in order to incentivize buyers to stay in that market. And that it's worked largely. That market has fared much better. In terms of the labor shortage, the only reason why I say that's not in our control, let me reframe that a little bit. It is in our control. We need to be coming up with long-term solutions to that problem. One of the big things that we can be doing is developing trade schools, right? So WestMech does it really well. There's a number of folks that do it really well. The only problem that I have with that is, again, it's going to be a 3 to 5 year lag before you see any meaningful change in that, because it's going to take time to train people up. We should be doing that. It is a big part of the solution. I do believe there are incentives that should be given to folks that are doing that, so that they're better able to do that. I don't have the expertise to speak on that specifically, but I am just looking at things in terms of, if we wanted to make the biggest impact today with the lowest hanging fruit, how would we do it? And that's kind of how I got to housing policy. But you are absolutely correct. We really need those trade schools. We really need labor development. And at some point, some of that workforce will have to come from elsewhere. We will import it from other states. But then it becomes kind of this, snake eating its own tail, where it's like, okay, we could import some of these folks, but we don't have the housing to house them. They can't afford to live here. So why do they move here? Then it becomes an economic development issue and a labor availability issue. And so it is a really complex problem. And you need both. You need to have affordable and workforce housing for those trades to move here. And then you need to be able to educate them internally and start generating them yourself. And Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add? Because it felt like this lends itself really nicely to a conversation about, incentives and subsidies for the affordable side.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. And thanks, Senator Epstein, for the question. I think, when we're talking about the labor shortage, when we're talking about building housing and economic development in general, those two things just go hand in hand. So one thing that we actually hear quite often when we go into a community, and like I've said before, Dominium does all affordable housing utilizing the low-income housing tax credit program. And we build quite a bit of units. That's the goal. And we hear from folks when we get to an area, and honestly, half the time it's from folks that we're contracting with, that they're really excited about this housing specifically for their workers. So when we talk about the need for labor and the need for income growth and job growth and those types of things, housing is a necessity for that. So when we look to, incentivizing things with housing, which the state legislature did some great things this year. There was $150 million that was put towards the State Housing Trust Fund, which was a huge win. So thanks to you for that, and thanks to other folks in the legislature. And then, we also got some regulation changed around private activity bonds and, the way that private activity bonds, which is a financing mechanism for the low-income housing tax credit program, are utilized. And we're now going to be prioritizing private activity bonds for multifamily housing, which is huge and just a really big deal. There's other things we can do, right? The state low-income housing tax credit can definitely be improved, can definitely be put a higher appropriation towards. And then the other thing is zoning, right? I know it's a big conversation that's been talked about in the state legislature. Obviously, there's different sides to each issue, but I think we need to get away from the idea of state control versus local control and understand, from a policy perspective, that the problem is we don't have enough land. The problem is supply and demand. It's not, that's not up for debate. So whoever wants to fix that problem, I think developers are on board with that. But it's ultimately kind of that conversation. And then the last thing I want to do is I just want to throw it over to Ash, because I want to be able to have her talk to folks real quickly about how they can get involved. Because I think when we're talking about all these policy changes, that you brought up, Senator, I think we need to hear about how individual people can get involved, because ultimately, it's been my experience, I'm sure you can relate to this, but local elected officials and our statewide legislative elected officials really look to their constituents for their ideas and their thoughts. So Ash, if you can jump in here and just talk about some local advocacy, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's a couple of really great examples in our community, and then a few other ones that have worked well in other communities. And so, in the Phoenix metro area, for example, one really exciting housing opportunity, I guess two really, that are coming to the Phoenix City Council this fall, is the text amendment to allow accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. And I'm on the Central City Village Planning Committee, and I'm so proud that our committee approved that 10-4 last night, and it's making its way to Planning Commission. So if you're in the Phoenix metro area, that's one really great way that you could write your city council member, write the mayor. You could potentially register for that city council meeting and speak in favor of accessory dwelling units, because we know that that will significantly increase our supply of affordable housing. Another local thing that's happening in Phoenix as well is the request to reduce the parking minimums. And this one was a little bit more challenging for us to approve. We did approve it last night, but parking mandatory or required minimum numbers of parking spaces are a major barrier to people who are trying to develop housing. It keeps the costs very expensive. And so a lot of people also don't know the history of parking minimums is rooted in racial segregation. It was a tactic to keep lower income housing from being built in certain areas, because by having parking minimums, it's too expensive to lower the rents. And so people, just an aside about the history of that. But yeah, those are two local things. And then I know, in Flagstaff, there was a proposition that made the ballot to create a fund to fund affordable housing. There's a lot of general obligation bond stuff that comes through local cities. So I really just think the best thing to do is to keep an eye on whatever your city is, what's coming through the city council, because those things are huge. Those things are, like I said, so much larger than people give credit for and they understand. So those would be my tips. Thanks, Sarah.
And thank you, Ash. And just to chime in, I know we're running short on time, but to follow up with Ash and to follow up a little bit more about process happening next, we'll at the very end of this put those two links in. One is the interest form, and then one is that letter. That letter is just to get you warmed up. But Abby and others, there's the ADU is coming up. So it was at village level this week and the previous week. It's going to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. That will be the next activation for a Phoenix specific thing to do. So we've built a work plan by 5 geographies specifically for right now: Phoenix, Chandler, Surprise, and Buckeye, and then one outside of Maricopa County, but also looking at different cities beyond those 5 for things that you can do. So thank you, Ash, for commenting on the ADU, for example, in Phoenix. That will be the next one that comes up. Specific for those of you that live in Phoenix, you'll see an action alert for all of you to do something. Again, at the end of this, we didn't want to overwhelm everybody with there's all sorts of things to do. You're going to have to kind of test the waters of what makes you comfortable for things you're willing to do. But that first thing for Phoenix anyway will be the ADUs that comes up in early August. So stay tuned for more on that as we move these forward. There's going to be stuff to do in every city across the valley and across the state, all under that Home is Where It All Starts campaign. So there's set language, there's set ways to talk about things that we want everybody to agree to. That'll come in that form, that interest form that we send out. But then also there'll be more specific things afterwards once you tell us how much time you want to spend on any of these things. Again, as Ash said, the highest level is to build those relationships. And that takes time. There's also the very just showing up to things and saying, hey, we're going to be a calm, reasonable voice here to say yes to this. And we're not going to get loud, and we're not going to get to be disrespectful and all the other things that are happening in some of these council meetings. We're just here to tell you home is important. And so there'll be those opportunities as well. I know we still have Greg, and I think Bob still had a question, and then Brent. Brent, let's have you with the final question. Hopefully it's a quick one that the presenters can go and have a quick answer to. I'll give a couple more wrap up things, and then we'll close out.
Thank you very much. This has been super informative. I just want to say to Ash and the Encanto Village committee last night, we also passed this ADU thing, and I would just love to see something added onto it by September that restricts ADUs to being rented at a 30-day or longer period so that they don't become short-term rentals and they actually do impact our housing. But what I wanted to ask real quickly was density issues. I was chair of the Encanto Village planning for the last 2 years, and I just wish we saw more density projects, higher density projects coming in front of the city of Phoenix specifically and throughout the valley, because there's only so many 4 and 5 story apartment buildings that we could fit up and down Central Avenue. And if we made those 10, 12, 15 story buildings, 20 story buildings, 30 story buildings, it would help with housing to a point that would be such an impact. And we've just got the first one. It's Central in Virginia that went through village planning this past month. And I would love to hear from developers or people that are involved. What is that huge fear from getting out of the wood frames into concrete and steel? Is it just cost, or is there other concerns that are stopping people from doing it? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brent. Let me hop in here, and then Nico, if you're still on, I might throw it to you from the construction standpoint. But when it comes to height and what we're trying to do developing, most of it comes down, and I'm not going to say most of it, all of it comes down to zoning until it becomes a financing conversation. So what I often say is we could take the entire budget of the state of Arizona and put it towards affordable housing. It wouldn't matter if we didn't have zone land. So a lot of that is zoning. Affordable housing developers cannot afford to compete with market rate developers when it comes to land pricing because of the lack of supply. So prices for land are so high. And then affordable housing developers have to add an additional 9 to 12 months for the LIHTC and bond processing of applications. So automatically, our interest, our proposal is less likely to get picked by a broker unless they have kind of some mission-minded aspect to their business as well. So then when it comes to, first of all, we want to find zoned land because it's cheaper. If we can't find zoned land, we go through a rezone. And at that point, it becomes really up to the city. So we would love to do density. We would love to add density wherever we can, so long as it can be managed appropriately. But a really good example of kind of where Phoenix is at, right? We're the 10th largest metro in the entire country at this point. And in density, we rank 106th, right under, I think it's Fort Wayne, Indiana, or Muncie, one of those two. So we just, the city is not, or the metro as a whole, not just the city of Phoenix. I mean, it's primarily not the city of Phoenix, is afraid of density. There's concerns. A lot of the general plans were written prior to all of the massive population boom. So when we talk about a need for zoning, we're talking about a need to zone high density multifamily areas and allow height. Because the other thing that cities like to do is limit density by limiting height. So then we have to go through a height variance, and in most cities, a height variance is the exact same public process as a rezone. So it just becomes kind of this back and forth. That's from a zoning perspective. Nico, if you're still on, I'd love to throw it to you if there's any kind of concern on the wood framing versus metal. Not my department.
Yeah. So one thing I'll kind of preface this by saying is I do want to give some credit where credit is due. First of all, Brent, thank you for your service on the Encanto Village. And Ash, thank you for your service on the Central City Village. I think the city of Phoenix, more than most municipalities, has been a lot more accommodative of density. Now, is there more that they can do? Absolutely. But I think they have really done a good job in leading the charge in getting good projects approved, in boosting density, in boosting height. The issue with going over 7 stories is that the economics just don't allow it in our market. And here's what I mean. I say 7 stories because with wood frame, you can build up to 5 stories. If you put a podium parking structure underneath it that's 2 stories, you can have what's called 5/2. So you get to kind of the 7 stories. When you go over 7 stories, you're really looking at a different type of construction, which is governed by a completely different building code. And the costs of that construction are astronomically higher. And so you have to get a certain price per square foot in order to justify the costs. And so what you end up having is, that's why you see in San Francisco, LA, Chicago, even Miami, kind of these, or New York, these more high-rise markets, because you can get people to pay the $2,500 for a studio apartment that is required to justify that cost. Historically, our market has not been able to do that anywhere. In the last 5 to 10 years, you've really started to see that happen downtown, some places along Central Avenue. I personally own a really great piece of real estate that is zoned for 3 22-story towers. We can't get the market to build it. We just can't get anybody to believe in that story at that location. And that has become particularly pronounced as office as an asset class has cratered, because that was one of the few places where people might build a 22-story tower is, hey, let's do a new Class A corporate headquarters. But unfortunately, in the current environment, the only people that would look at that is residential. And it's just a really risky proposition, because if you're wrong on your rent numbers, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with One Camelback at the southeast corner of Central and Camelback, that project is an office conversion that's been under construction. It's got to be for like 3 or 4 years now. They fired 2 general contractors, and the rents that they need to hit in order to make that profitable, are just heroic, Herculean. And so, Brent, I don't know if that answers your question, but I would tell you it's largely a cost issue and an economics issue. The rent that you have to pass on to the end consumer just makes it really difficult to justify those projects. We will see more of that in the next decade, but it will not be a way to deliver any kind of affordability. It will be kind of top of the market Class A++ units that will be delivered in that form.
Thanks, Nico. So folks, it is about it's 2:38 where I'm at. It's 12:38 where y'all are at. So I am happy to stay on if anybody has additional questions, but I want to be, appropriate for our panelists and allow them to hop off, and anybody else who's got, other meetings and things. So we're going to wrap it here, but I will stay on. I'm sure Dave and Amanda are happy to stay on just to chat with anybody else who has additional questions. And from there, just thank you guys all for coming. We really appreciate it. My email's in the chat. Dave and Amanda, I'm sure, are able to be gotten a hold of in the materials that they've sent. And we are more than happy to chat with anybody really at any time. Hopefully you can tell all of us are very passionate about this. So please reach out, and that's where we're at. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sarah.